If your house was on fire and the fire chief walked up to the flames, squinted real hard, and then announced to everyone, "Good news, everybody. I've decided the fire isn't real." How would you feel? Would you feel reassured? Or would you maybe, just maybe, wonder whether we've entered the part of the movie where the adults in charge have absolutely no idea what they're doing? Because that is where we are. Yesterday, President Donald Trump stood up and announced that he is moving to overturn a wide swath of climate change regulations. Regulations designed to limit emissions, to protect air and water, to slow down the warming of a planet that is already very clearly warming. And the justification? Well, set of claims about climate science that scientists, actual credentialed non-cable news scientists, are already calling misleading, cherry-picked, or just flat out wrong. At the same time, and this part is almost too on the nose, a federal judge has ruled that the closed-door meetings used to shape this decision violated federal law. Why? Because they were held in secret, because the participants were handpicked, because the process excluded the scientists and experts who might have said, "Hey, maybe don't set the house on fire and then call it a home improvement." So we're going to talk about what was announced and why the science behind it just doesn't hold up, and how the legal ruling on those secret meetings makes the whole thing smell less like policy and more like, well, I mean, let's just say it. It smells like something you'd step in and scrape off your shoe. This story is about climate change. It's a story about power, and it's a story about what happens when ideology collides head-on with reality. Hello all, you're listening to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And this week, the main topic is the decision by the Trump administration to disregard the 2009 EPA endangerment finding. This was a landmark regulatory determination stating that greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, methane, and others, threaten the public health and welfare of current and future generations. It was based on countless peer-reviewed studies by thousands of scientists. What's more, in the years since 2009, the only information that has come out has supported the concept. But as we'll get into, some secret backroom meetings, and no, that's not hyperbole, have resulted in Trump dismantling years of decision and action to help deal with climate change. But before I hit you with all of that, let me talk about some hot topics. This first one borders on humorous, but in the end, I guess it really isn't. But over the past couple of weeks, I'm sure you're all familiar, a genuinely strange political controversy bubbled up around something that in a normal country would simply be filed under entertainment and moved on from. The Super Bowl halftime show. Specifically, the selection of global music superstar Bad Bunny and the reaction from a number of Republican lawmakers who have now gone so far as to file formal complaints with the FCC over what they claim was vulgar and inappropriate content. And I gotta tell you, the whole thing says a lot more about where we are politically than it does about anything that actually happened during that show. So let's rewind just a little bit. When Bad Bunny was first announced as the Super Bowl halftime performer, the reaction in most of the world was exactly what you'd expect: excitement. This is one of the biggest artists on the planet. He's not just big in Latin music, he's big in music, period. Stadiums, streaming charts, global tours, social media followers, cultural influence. The NFL didn't exactly pull a name out of a hat on this one. They booked one of the most commercially successful and culturally relevant performers currently alive. But in certain political circles, particularly on the MAGA end of things, the reaction was not excitement. It was full panic. Actual panic. You started seeing posts and commentary and segments suggesting that this was somehow an insult to America, that the Super Bowl, the most American of American sporting events, was being taken over by someone who, in their words, didn't represent real America. And here's where things immediately went off the rails. Because, of course, Bad Bunny is Puerto Rican, which means he is American. Full stop. The amount of people who have been seen on videos, clips from news shows and podcasts who didn't know that being Puerto Rican made you American is dumbfounding. But anyway, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. They serve in the military. In fact, at a per capita rate higher than almost any other place in the United States. They vote in primaries. They carry American passports. This isn't complicated. It's basic 8th grade civics. Yet you had people going on television and social media acting as though the NFL had somehow imported a foreign performer to undermine American culture. I mean, now, let's not pretend that it would have been the first non-American performer. You can find that list out there. There were plenty of them. But the irony is almost too perfect. A man born under the American flag performing at an American sporting event being called un-American by people who apparently slept through social studies class. But as it turns out, that was just the warm-up. Once it became clear that Bad Bunny was actually going to perform, that this wasn't some rumor or whatever, the rhetoric intensified. Suddenly, the issue wasn't just who he was, it was what language he performs in, specifically Spanish. There was a wave of commentary suggesting that having songs performed in Spanish during the Super Bowl halftime show was somehow divisive. That it excluded English-speaking viewers. That it represented some kind of cultural shift that should make people uncomfortable just on its face. I'm not exaggerating here. Some commentators openly framed the presence of Spanish language music as a threat to unity. Which is fascinating because Spanish has been spoken in what is now the United States for longer than English has. Before there was a United States, before there was a Constitution, before there was a Super Bowl, there were Spanish-speaking communities across huge portions of what would become this country. The idea that hearing Spanish on an American stage is somehow alien or un-American is just historically illiterate. And again, we come back to the central absurdity. Bad Bunny isn't even a visiting international artist. He's an American artist from Puerto Rico. So the notion that Spanish language music at the Super Bowl is somehow foreign intrusion, I mean, let's be generous, it's confused. But the reaction didn't stop at commentary. It escalated into something even stranger. You may have heard, or maybe even watched, the alternate halftime show produced by Turning Point USA. A pre-taped, patriotic, in quotes, halftime event that circulated online among conservative audiences. It was essentially framed as a corrective measure, a replacement, a real halftime show for people who didn't like the one happening on their televisions. And look, anyone can produce whatever content they want. That's free speech. Of course it is. But the existence of an alternative pre-recorded halftime show designed specifically as a political counter-programming move tells you something about how cultural movements are now being treated as, ideological battlegrounds. We're not just talking about football and music anymore. Everything has to be politics. Everything is identity. Everything is a front in the culture war. Now we get to the latest development, the one that really pushes this whole saga into surreal territory. Several Republican senators have filed complaints with the Federal Communications Commission regarding Bad Bunny's halftime performance. The claim that the lyrics performed during the show were vulgar and inappropriate for broadcast television. And, if you had an irony meter, this is where it starts spinning. Because remember what many of these same voices were saying just days earlier, that the performance was problematic because it was in Spanish and therefore no one could understand it. That it excluded English speakers, that viewers had no idea what was being said. So let's just pause and appreciate the logical gymnastics here. First, the performance is bad because you can't understand what he's saying. Then, within a day or two, it becomes bad because you can understand what he's saying and it's allegedly vulgar. So which is it? Is the problem that the lyrics were unintelligible, or is the problem that they were objectionable? It really can't be both, right? This is what happens when outrage comes first, and then justification has to fill in the gaps afterwards. You end up chasing your own talking points in circles. Now, let's talk about how Super Bowl halftime shows actually work, because there seems to be some confusion or perhaps selective amnesia about the process. Super Bowl halftime show is one of the most tightly controlled live broadcasts in existence. Every single element is reviewed. Every lyric, every camera angle, every visual, every piece of choreography. There is coordination between the NFL, the network broadcaster, in this case it was NBC, the production teams, standards and practices departments, and often even federal broadcast compliance experts. This isn't an open mic night at a local bar. Nothing goes on that stage without layers upon layers of approval. This is especially true since the whole Janet Jackson wardrobe malfunction debacle. But this certainly includes lyrics. Before the halftime performer ever steps onto that field, the songs they plan to perform are reviewed and cleared. If there are explicit lyrics in the original recordings, and let's be honest, in modern popular music, there often are, those lyrics are either removed, replaced, or the performer uses radio-friendly versions. This is standard operating procedure. It has been for many, many years. You can go back through halftime shows from multiple eras and see the same process at work. So the idea that somehow explicit or broadcast prohibited content just slipped on through unnoticed is not credible. NBC has standards and practices departments specifically to deal with stuff like that. The NFL has brand considerations worth billions of dollars tied to that broadcast. They are not going to allow anything that would trigger FCC fines or advertiser backlash. It simply does not happen. What viewers saw during the halftime show were versions of songs that had been vetted, edited where necessary, and approved prior to the broadcast. In other words, the same type of radio-friendly or network-safe versions that have been used in televised performances for years. This is not new. It's not unique to this artist. It is absolutely positively the norm. And here's another interesting wrinkle. The FCC typically responds to broadcast complaints based on whether material actually violates indecency standards, which are very specific and narrowly defined. Those standards focus on explicit sexual or excretory content that is patently offensive under contemporary community standards and aired during times when children are likely to be in the audience. Even then, context matters, intent matters, presentation matters. A performance that has already been reviewed and cleared by network standards teams that uses edited lyrics that airs within established broadcast guidelines is extremely unlikely to meet the threshold for FCC action. Complaints can be filed. Anyone can file a complaint, but that doesn't mean they will lead to findings of wrongdoing. So what we're left with is something that feels less like a genuine regulatory concern and more like a political stunt, a way of signaling disapproval, a way of continuing the culture war narrative that surrounded the performance from the moment it was announced. And let's zoom out for a second. We're in a moment where cultural events are being treated as political battlegrounds. Music, movies, sports, halftime shows. Everything gets filtered through a partisan lens. If an artist speaks Spanish, it becomes a political issue. If an artist represents a demographic group, it becomes a political issue. If an artist expresses a perspective, it becomes a political issue. It is exhausting, and it's also revealing. Because when you strip away the noise, what you see is a pattern, an increasing tendency to frame cultural diversity as a threat rather than a reflection of what America actually is. A country that has always contained multiple languages, multiple cultures, multiple identities. A country where a Puerto Rican artist performing in Spanish at the Super Bowl is not some radical departure from tradition, but a continuation of the evolving American story. And maybe that's what makes some people uncomfortable. It's not the lyrics, not the broadcast standards, not the FCC, but the simple reality that American culture is broader and more diverse than the narrow definition that they would prefer. The truth is, the Super Bowl halftime show has always been a reflection of the moment. In some years, it leans rock, and other years it leans pop, sometimes hip-hop, sometimes country, sometimes legacy acts, sometimes global superstars. It changes because the culture changes, because the audience changes, because America itself is always changing. That doesn't mean every performance will be everyone's cup of tea. Art is subjective. Music is subjective. You don't have to like every halftime show. I'm not a big Bad Bunny fan. In fact, I was barely aware of the artist before all this drama started. You don't have to stream his albums. The remote control exists for a reason. But turning artistic preference into a federal complaint, turning a musical performance into a regulatory issue because of it being in Spanish, that's a different level of reaction. And it tells us something about where we are. We're in an era where political identity increasingly shapes how people interpret even the most mundane cultural moments. A halftime show isn't just a halftime show, it's a symbol, it's a statement, it's a flashpoint. And once that happens, it becomes less about what actually occurred and more about what people believe it represents. So now we have senators filing FCC complaints over a performance that was reviewed and cleared and broadcast according to standard procedures. We have commentary claiming vulgarity from some of the same voices that claim they couldn't understand the lyrics at all. We have alternative halftime shows produced as ideological counter-programming. And we have a broader conversation about language identity and what it means to be American playing out through the lens of a football game. If nothing else, it's a reminder of how deeply politics have permeated every single corner of our cultural life. Even the spaces that used to be shared, the spaces that used to bring people together now get pulled into some sort of gravitational force field of partisan conflict. But here's a thought. Maybe the fact that a Puerto Rican artist can headline the Super Bowl halftime show is actually a sign of something positive. A sign that American culture is expansive enough to include multiple languages, multiple perspectives, multiple sounds. A sign that what it means to be American isn't fixed in one era or one identity, but is always evolving. And maybe, just maybe, that's something worth celebrating instead of bitching about. Because at the end of the day, it was a halftime show, a performance, a few songs on a stage during a football game. The Republic will survive. The Constitution will remain intact. And next year, there will be another halftime show and another artist and probably another round of drama because that's just where we are right now. But it's worth remembering that culture isn't a zero-sum game. One artist performing in Spanish does not erase anyone else. One performance doesn't define the entire nation. It's just a moment, a snapshot, a reflection of a country that has always been more diverse and more complicated, and to me more interesting than the narrowest definitions that you get for it. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, well, that might say more about them than it does about the music. Next, we move on to everyone's favorite topic, ICE. Over the last few days, you may have seen headlines saying that ICE is pulling out of Minnesota. Pulling out, scaling back, ending the operation. Depending on which headline you read, it sounds either like a major course correction or like nothing is really changing at all. So I want to talk through what has actually been said about this and the so-called pullout and what we know about the timeline, whether this is a full removal or just a reshuffling, and then, maybe most importantly, what hasn't changed. Because despite all the outrage, all the video, all the public pressure, and yes, despite the deaths of 2 U.S. citizens at the hands of federal agents, precious little about how these operations are being conducted appears to have changed. And we'll wrap up with a quick look at what's happening with Congress right now as far as DHS funding is concerned and what that means. Because as always, the rhetoric and the reality are probably not quite the same. So let's start with the big headline. ICE is pulling out of Minnesota. That's the phrase being used. But when you dig into what federal officials have actually said, the wording becomes a lot more careful, a lot more bureaucratic, a lot more vague. What has been announced is a, quote, significant drawdown, end quote, of the surge of ICE and federal immigration agents that were deployed to Minnesota following the controversial operation that began earlier this year. Officials say the surge is being wound down. They say agents will be redeployed. They say the mission is shifting. What they have not actually said is that ICE is leaving Minnesota entirely. There's a big difference between ending a surge and ending operations. And right now, what we appear to be seeing is not a total withdrawal, but a scaling back, a redistribution of personnel and resources rather than a clean exit. Earlier in the operation, thousands of personnel were sent into the state. Some have already been pulled out in stages. More are expected to leave over the coming days and weeks. But ICE, as an agency, is not packing up and saying, we've done enough here. Field offices remain, enforcement authority remains, ongoing cases remain. So when you hear ICE pull out, understand that what's happening is more like turning down the volume than it is turning off the music. And there is no single clear public timeline that says on this date all federal immigration enforcement activity in Minnesota ends or anything like that. The timeline does not exist, at least not publicly. Instead, what we're getting is a gradual wind down of the surge operation, a phrase that sounds reassuring if you say it fast enough, but leaves a lot of room for interpretation. Now, why is this happening at all? Let's not pretend this is occurring in a vacuum. This pullback comes after weeks of intense scrutiny and outrage following the deaths of 2 U.S. citizens during ICE operations in Minnesota. 2 people killed by agents who were supposedly there to enforce immigration law. 2 deaths that sparked protests, lawsuits, and a flood of questions about how these operations are actually conducted. Videos began circulating, videos of aggressive detentions, videos of agents in masks, videos of individuals being taken into custody by people who refused to identify themselves in any real way. Videos of unmarked vehicles pulling up, doors opening, people being grabbed and driven away. And suddenly, a lot of Americans, not just immigrants, not just activists, but average everyday folks started asking a very basic question. What exactly is going on here? That public pressure matters. It always does. And it is almost certainly a factor in why this surge is now being scaled back. Officials will frame it as mission accomplished or strategic deployment or the natural end of an operational phase. Governments are very, very good at that kind of language. But let's be honest, the timing isn't coincidental. Now, here's where things get uncomfortable. Because for all the headlines about pulling out, for all the talk about reviewing policies, for all the statements about transparency and accountability and actual day-to-day operational practices that spark so much outrage appear largely unchanged. Agents are still wearing masks. They are still, in most cases, not providing clear identification. They are still operating out of unmarked vehicles and armed to the teeth. And these are not minor cosmetic concerns. These are not superficial complaints. They're fundamental issues about accountability and public trust. If an armed group of individuals can detain you on the street without clearly identifying themselves, without, visible badges, without marked vehicles, and without immediate explanation, that raises some very basic civil liberties questions. It should for everyone, especially since it's clear that not all of the people that they've been interacting with, to use a kind word, are immigrants, let alone illegal immigrants. These questions should go well beyond immigration policy and into the realm of how federal law enforcement is allowed to operate inside the United States. Critics, and not just on the left, have pointed out that these tactics make it extremely difficult for civilians to know who is detaining them, extremely difficult for journalists to document operations, and extremely difficult for communities to trust that what they're seeing is lawful rather than something far, far more troubling. And yet, despite all the controversy, there has been no announcement saying these practices will end. No clear directive saying agents must show identification at all times. No firm commitment that masks will be removed. No prohibition on the use of unmarked or, in many cases, personal vehicles. Those issues all remain unsolved. And then there is the question that hangs over everything: accountability. The 2 U.S. citizens are dead. That fact alone should have triggered immediate, visible, transparent action. At minimum, you would have expected to see clear public communication about investigations, about whether agents involved have been suspended or reassigned or placed on leave, and about what steps are being taken to ensure more things like this don't happen. Instead, the information has been sparse, to put it kindly. We have been told investigations are ongoing. We have been told reviews are underway. We have been told officials are taking the matter very seriously. What we have not been told, at least not clearly and publicly, is whether any agents will face any meaningful consequences. Have there been terminations, suspensions, any disciplinary actions at all? Policy changes directly tied to the things that caused those deaths. If those things have happened, they've not been communicated in a way that is visible or transparent to anyone. And the lack of visible accountability fuels the perception, fair or not, that the system closes ranks when federal agents are involved, that investigations move slowly and quietly and out of the public view, that consequences, when they exist, may be purely administrative rather than criminal. For communities already skeptical of federal enforcement, that perception is like gasoline on a fire. Now, zoom out for a moment, because while Minneapolis, Minnesota have been the flashpoint, ICE operations nationwide have not stopped. The agency continues to function at full steam. Enforcement continues, detentions, deportations. The scaling back of one highly visible surge doesn't represent a fundamental change in the federal immigration enforcement policy. It represents, at most, a tactical adjustment. And that brings us to Congress and the DHS funding fight. Right now, there is an ongoing fight in Washington over funding for the Department of Homeland Security, the umbrella agency that includes ICE. Lawmakers are arguing over how much money DHS should receive, what conditions should be attached to that funding, and whether any reforms to enforcement practices should be required. Some members of Congress have pushed for stricter oversight, clearer identification requirements, body cameras, limits on certain enforcement tactics. Others have pushed for increased funding with fewer restrictions, arguing that immigration enforcement must remain robust and flexible. Now, as of this moment, I'm recording this episode a little early for scheduling purposes, so right now it's Friday. But as of this moment, funding debates are still unfolding. There have been attempts to pass DHS funding packages, attempts to attach reform measures, and attempts to block funding without those reforms. It's the usual Washington tug of war where policy and politics and public perception all collide. But here's the key point. ICE doesn't simply stop operating because Congress is arguing. The agency has existing funding streams and operational authority. Even if funding debates drag on, day-to-day enforcement continues. So anyone out there who you've heard saying, the Democrats are stopping DHS is going to close because of the Democrats, they're wrong, pure and simple. So while Minnesota surge may be winding down, the broader machinery of federal immigration enforcement is very much still running and will continue to run. And that brings us to the heart of the matter. There has been a lot of rhetoric around what happened in Minnesota, a lot of statements, a lot of promises to review, reassess, learn lessons, a lot of assurances that concerns are being taken seriously. But we all know talk is cheap. What people tend to look for is a change they can actually see. Are agents operating differently today than they were a month ago? Are identification policies different? Are accountability mechanisms more visible? Are communities being given reason to trust what happened will not happen again? And so far, the answer to those questions remains murky. Scaling back a surge is not the same thing as reforming a system. Redeploying personnel is not the same as addressing underlying concerns, and announcing a pullout, partial or otherwise, does not automatically resolve the issues that caused the public outrage in the first place. So yes, ICE is pulling back from Minnesota, at least in terms of the surge that put thousands of additional agents on the ground. That drawdown appears to be underway and will likely continue in the coming days, but it is not a total disappearance. It is not a sweeping policy overhaul or a policy change at all, for that matter. And it does not by itself answer the larger questions that have been raised about how federal immigration enforcement is conducted, how agents are held accountable, and how communities are supposed to trust a system that often operates behind masks and behind tinted windows and behind layers of bureaucracy. Those questions all remain. And until we start seeing clear, visible answers, not just press releases, not just carefully worded statements, but actual tangible changes, the gap between what they're saying and what is happening on the ground will continue to be noticeable. And that gap, more than anything else, is where the public trust either grows or quietly fades. For the third hot topic this week, I want to talk about something that, frankly, I shouldn't have to think is controversial. It shouldn't be political. It shouldn't be partisan. It shouldn't be ideological. It should just be human. I want to talk about the victims who showed up at the recent congressional hearing where Pam Bondi testified about the Department of Justice and its supposed investigations into the Epstein files. Victims who stood up, physically stood up in that room. Victims who said clearly and publicly, we asked to be interviewed. We are still waiting to be interviewed. And no one from these investigations has interviewed us. Now, just let that sink in for just a moment. Because what we're being told, what the public is being told, is that there have been extensive and serious, comprehensive investigations. Thorough, exhaustive, completed, ongoing, depending on who you hear the statement from. And yet, the very people who were harmed, the very people whose lives were shattered, some of the very people who were trafficked, abused, manipulated, and silenced, are saying they have not even been asked to tell their stories. Now, that's not bureaucratic oversight. That's not a scheduling issue. That's not some sort of administrative hiccup. That's a flashing, blaring 5-alarm fire. Because in what universe, in what reality, can you claim to have conducted a complete investigation into a trafficking and abuse network without talking to victims? It's ludicrous. It's absolutely absurd. And it's insulting. And most of all, it's dangerous. We've all heard the phrase, listen to the victims. We've heard it after every scandal, every revelation, every documentary, every trial. Listen to the victims. Believe the victims. Those words get said a lot. They get printed on statements and read off teleprompters. They get turned into hashtags and they're put on press releases. But when the moment comes, when the actual human beings who were actually harmed stand up in a room and say, hey, we're here, we're willing, we want to talk, suddenly the system develops a hearing issue. Suddenly there's silence, there's avoidance, and let's be honest, a little bit of smirking. One of the most striking moments from that hearing wasn't even what was said, and trust me, there were a lot of striking moments in what was said, but one of them was what was seen. When those victims stood up, when they made themselves visible, cameras captured a moment that a lot of people watching, including me, still couldn't quite believe. Pam Bondi, seated there, did not look at them, did not even acknowledge them, certainly didn't engage. Instead, she appeared to sit with a smirk on her face. Now look, people can argue about interpretations, people can debate facial expressions, people can say, well, maybe that's not what was happening. Fine. I mean, we can debate that, I guess. But here's what can't be debated. Victims stood up in that room and said they had not been interviewed. They said they were willing to be interviewed. They said they wanted to cooperate. And the response they received visually and substantively did not convey urgency or compassion. It didn't convey a burning desire to hear them. It conveyed ambivalence at best. Distance. And that distance sends a message. A powerful message, I think. A chilling message. Because what does it tell other victims? Not just in this case, but in every case involving powerful people. It tells them, you can come forward, you can speak up, you can make yourself visible, and you still might be ignored. Think about what that takes for a survivor of sexual exploitation or trafficking to stand up publicly. The courage, the emotional cost, the risk of harassment, disbelief, and public scrutiny. These are people who have already been through unimaginable trauma. Many have spent years, decades, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy. Some have struggled with addiction and depression, broken relationships, financial problems, all the long shadows that trauma like that can cast. And then they decide to step forward again, to re-enter the public arena, reopening their wounds, to say, I'll tell my story if it helps bring accountability. And what happens? They get sidelined, treated as an afterthought. If you were a victim watching that hearing, if you were someone out there who had been harmed by someone powerful, someone connected, someone wealthy, what lesson would you take from that moment? Would you feel encouraged to come forward? Would you have any confidence that your voice matters in the least? Would you believe that the system is truly interested in your testimony? Or would you think, why freaking bother? That's the signal to send. That's the ripple effect. When authorities claim they've conducted thorough investigations without even interviewing willing victims who are actively offering to speak, It undermines the very idea that any investigation was done at all. Justice is supposed to be about truth. And truth, in cases like this, lives with the victims. Their experiences, their memories, their accounts of who did what, when and where. You can't piece together the full scope of a trafficking network by only looking at documents and flight logs and financial records. Those things matter, of course, but they are not the whole picture. The whole picture includes human testimony, human experience, human harm. If you leave victims out of the process, you treat them as, optional. Then what you're conducting is not a full investigation, it's a partial one, curated, sanitized. And when powerful names are potentially involved, wealthy names, connected names, influential names, that omission starts to look less like incompetence and more like a pattern that we've seen before. Because this isn't new. This is, very sadly, old. For as long as there have been systems of power, victims, especially victims without any power, have often been the last consideration when those systems are threatened. When allegations point upward towards wealth and status and influence, the machinery of accountability slows down. Doors close. Conversations happen behind the scenes. Reputations get protected. Careers get shielded. And somewhere in all of that, the victims get lost. Or, as in this case, ignored. It's the age-old story, when the powerful are at risk, the powerless become expendable. Now, to be clear, none of this is about predetermined conclusions about any specific individual's guilt or innocence. That's not the point here. Investigations exist to determine facts. Evidence matters. Due process matters. But you cannot determine facts if you deliberately avoid the people who hold them. You cannot claim thoroughness while skipping the most essential witnesses. You cannot say you care about justice while sidelining the very people who were harmed. And when officials sit in hearings and speak confidently about completed or ongoing investigations while the victims themselves are saying, "You haven't even talked to us," that contradiction is impossible to ignore. It deepens the already massive credibility gap between the public and the institutions that are supposed to be protecting them. Because from the outside looking in, it begins to feel like there are two systems of justice. The one for the ordinary people, and the one for the rich and the connected. If an average person were accused of running a trafficking operation, do we really believe investigators would skip interviewing victims who volunteered to come forward? Do we believe authorities would say, no thanks, we've got it? Of course not. Victim testimony would be central, essential, and immediate. So why does it seem different here? Why does it appear that the very people most directly affected are being treated as peripheral? That question doesn't just hang over this case. It hangs over the entire concept of accountability for the powerful. And here's the deeper, more painful truth, I think. When victims see this kind of response, or lack of response, it doesn't just affect one investigation. It shapes how survivors everywhere view the system. Every time a victim is ignored, another potential victim stays silent. Every time testimony is brushed aside, another survivor decides it's safer to just be quiet. Every time the powerful appear insulated from any scrutiny, trust in the system erodes a little more. We cannot build a society where victims feel safe coming forward if they believe their voices will be treated as optional. We can't claim to champion accountability if we only pursue it selectively. We can't say listen to victims when it's convenient and then turn away when it's uncomfortable. The people who stood up in that hearing did something incredibly brave. They made themselves visible. They made themselves heard. They reminded everyone watching that behind all the legal language and political nonsense are real human beings whose lives were profoundly affected. They deserved acknowledgement. They deserved engagement. They deserved to be taken seriously. And beyond them, every survivor watching deserved to see that voices of victims matter. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about one hearing or one official or one investigation. It's about what kind of message we're sending as a society. Do we tell victims, come forward, we want to hear you, or do we tell them implicitly, we'll listen unless it gets complicated? Do we show that no one is above scrutiny, or do we reinforce the old corrosive belief that wealth and power create a protective bubble? These are not abstract questions. They shape whether people trust the system. They shape whether victims feel safe speaking. They shape whether justice is something people believe in or something they view as selective. If investigations are to have legitimacy, they must be thorough. And if they are to be thorough, they have to include victims. And if they claim to seek the truth, they can't turn away from the very people who hold it. Because when victims stand up and say, we're here, we're willing to talk, please listen, the only acceptable response, morally, ethically, professionally, is to listen. Okay, so now for this week's main topic. Yesterday, the Trump administration announced the sweeping rollback of several major climate-related regulations. The language used in the announcement framed it as a, quote, restoration of energy freedom, end quote, and a move to correct what they called exaggerated climate fears and economically damaging environmental overreach. Now, that's branding. The reality is a little less glossy. The rules targeted for reversal include emission standards and regulatory frameworks that were designed over multiple administrations, by the way, to reduce greenhouse gas output from power plants, industry, and transportation. These are not brand new rules that appeared last Tuesday. These are the result of decades of research, negotiation, and incremental policy building. And with one announcement, one stroke of the political pen, we're being told that all of it needs to go. Why? Credible scientists referred to this collection of information as the endangerment finding. According to Trump and the officials backing this move, the regulations are based on what they describe as uncertain science and inflated projections about global warming and its impacts. Now, when you hear phrases like uncertain science, it's meant to give it a reasonable sort of sheen on the surface. Science, after all, is always refining itself, always updating, always testing. But here's the problem. The overwhelming consensus in the scientific community is not uncertain in the least about the core issue. Human-driven climate change is a real thing. It is measurable, it is happening now, and it is accelerating. We're not talking about some fringe theory being debated in academic corners. We are talking about a global scientific consensus supported by decades of data from NASA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and other research institutions around the world. So when the administration frames this as correcting exaggerated fears, what they're really doing is rejecting a mountain of evidence that has been built brick by brick over generations. And scientists, the ones who actually study this stuff for a living, were quick to respond. Within hours of the announcement, climate researchers and scientific organizations began pushing back. Many pointed out that the claims used to justify the rollback rely heavily on selective interpretation of data. In other words, cherry picking. For one example, one of the talking points emphasized by the administration was that certain temperature increases have not occurred as rapidly as some earlier projections suggested. That sounds damning until you realize that climate projections are based on different emission scenarios. Some scenarios assumed aggressive mitigation efforts, others assumed business as usual. When mitigation happens, even partially, warming can appear slightly lower in certain windows. That doesn't mean the underlying science is wrong. It means policy and behavior affect outcomes. It's like saying, well, my doctor said my cholesterol would get worse, but it only got a little worse. Well, yeah, because you stopped eating cheeseburgers for a month. Scientists also pointed out that the administration's claims ignore broader trends, rising global temperatures, shrinking ice sheets, intensifying heat waves, and increasingly severe weather patterns. These are not hypothetical future risks. They are present-day realities. But perhaps the most striking reaction from the scientific community wasn't just disagreement, it was frustration. Real, palpable frustration. Because many of the experts reacting to this announcement have spent their entire careers studying climate systems. They've published peer-reviewed research. They've testified before Congress. They've worked across political administrations for both parties. And yet here we are, again, watching policy decisions that seem to treat decades of valid scientific work like a Yelp review you can just scroll past. Now, if this were just a disagreement about policy priorities, economic versus environmental, short-term versus long-term, that would be one thing. Those debates are part of democracy. But that is not what's happening here. What's happening is a relitigation of basic facts. And that brings us to the second major piece of the story, the legal ruling that dropped like a thunderclap over the whole process. A federal judge has ruled that the meetings leading up to this policy decision likely violated federal law. Specifically, the concern centers on how these meetings were conducted and who was included, or rather, who wasn't. According to reporting and court findings, many of the discussions shaping this rollback were held behind closed doors. Not just routine executive branch deliberations, which do happen, but structured policy meetings that under federal advisory rules are supposed to meet certain transparency requirements. The judge's ruling points at two key issues. First, the secrecy of the meetings, and second, the selection of the people involved in the meeting. These meetings were not open to a balanced range of experts. Instead, participants were handpicked with heavy emphasis on industry representatives and individuals known to be skeptical of mainstream climate science. Now, let's pause for a moment and imagine how this would look in any other context. Imagine a pharmaceutical company convening a panel to evaluate the safety of one of its drugs, and only inviting people who already think the drug is perfectly safe. No independent researchers, no critical voices, no outside review. Would you call that a neutral process? You'd call that stacking the deck. That's essentially what this ruling suggests happened here. Federal law requires that when outside advisory groups are used to shape policy, they must be fairly balanced and operate transparently. The idea is simple. If you're going to make decisions that affect the public deserves to know how those decisions are being formed and by whom. According to the judge, that did not happen. The closed-door nature of the meetings and the selective invitation list appear to have violated both those requirements. The ruling doesn't just raise procedural concerns, it calls into question the legitimacy of the entire decision-making process where this is concerned. And when you combine that with the scientifically disputed claims used to justify this immense policy shift, you start to see why so many observers are calling the whole thing bogus. Because here's the thing. If science were truly on your side, the evidence genuinely supported your position, why would you need to hold secret meetings and handpick participants? Why not invite a broad range of experts? Why not open the process? Why not let the data speak? The answer is painfully obvious. This isn't really about science. It's about ideology. It's about power. To fully understand how we got here, though, you have to zoom out a bit and look at Donald Trump's long history with climate change. Because this didn't start yesterday. Trump has been publicly skeptical and often outright dismissive of climate change for years. Long before entering politics, he made statements suggesting that global warming was exaggerated or even fabricated. One of his most widely cited claims, made years ago, was that climate change was a hoax created by the Chinese to disadvantage American industry. Now, to be fair, he and his allies have sometimes tried to walk back that language a bit, reframing it as criticism of policy rather than denial of science. But, the pattern is consistent. Minimize the problem, question the data, and frame environmental regulation as an economic threat. During his previous time in office, the United States withdrew from international climate agreements, rolled back numerous environmental protections, and prioritized fossil fuel development. Many of those moves were controversial at the time and remain so. What we're seeing today isn't a departure from that pattern, it's a continuation. It's an escalation. And here's where the sarcasm part of our program kicks in, because if you listen closely to the messaging around this latest rollback, you hear a lot about freedom, energy freedom, economic freedom, freedom from regulation. You'll hear less about, say, the freedom to breathe clean air, or the freedom to avoid catastrophic flooding, or the freedom to not have your town turned into a recurring disaster zone every hurricane season. Apparently, those freedoms don't poll quite as well in certain boardrooms. Now, let's talk about the broader implications. Policy decisions like this don't happen in a vacuum. They send signals to markets, to industries, to other countries. When the U.S. weakens its climate regulations, it affects global momentum on emissions reduction. It shapes investment decisions. It influences whether companies move towards cleaner technologies or double down on the existing ones. And it affects public trust, because when people see a major policy shift justified by disputed science and shaped through potentially unlawful processes, it erodes confidence in governance. And less confidence in governance is not something that we need these days. Things like this feed the perception, and in this case, perhaps the reality, that decisions are being made not on the basis of evidence, but on the basis of who has access to the room. That's a dangerous precedent, regardless of where you fall politically. You don't have to be an environmental activist to feel uneasy about it. You just have to believe that policy should be grounded in reality and shaped through legitimate processes. And that brings us back to where we started. The feeling that this whole thing is bogus. Not bogus in the sense of being imaginary. Very, very real policies are being rolled back. Very real environmental protections are on the chopping block. But bogus in the sense that the justification does not hold up. Bogus in the sense that the process appears compromised. Bogus in the sense that the outcome seems predetermined, with the science and the meetings arranged to support it rather than to inform it. We are watching a policy decision that affects the entire planet being built on a foundation that looks, at best, shaky. At worst, deliberately engineered. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Climate change does not care about politics. It does not care about election cycles. It doesn't care about press releases or talking points or staged announcements at the White House. It responds to physics, to chemistry, to the accumulation of greenhouse gases in an atmosphere that doesn't have a pause button. You can argue about the regulations, you can debate economic trade-offs. Those can be legitimate conversations, but you cannot negotiate with reality. You can't ignore it, you can't deny it, you can't hold closed-door meetings to change it. But eventually, reality shows up. Usually with a heat wave or a flood or a wildfire or a storm that used to be called once in a century and now seems to happen every couple of years. So where does this go from here? Legally, the judge's ruling opens the door to challenges that could delay or even block parts of this rollback. If the process used to develop the policy is found to have violated federal law, courts may require it to be redone, this time with proper transparency and balanced input. Politically, the move will likely energize both supporters and critics. For some, it's a long-awaited dismantling of what they think is burdensome regulation. For others, it's a step backward at a time when urgency is increasing, not decreasing. And for the rest of us, the regular folks, just trying to make sense of the news, it's another reminder that the decisions shaping our future are often made in rooms we never see, based on information we're only partially allowed to see. Which is why conversations like this matter. Because understanding what's happening, really happening, is the first step towards deciding what kind of future we actually want. Do we want policy built on evidence and open debate, or policy built on selective data behind closed doors? Do we want leaders who engage with reality, even when it's inconvenient, or leaders who simply declare reality optional? Those are not abstract questions anymore. They're playing out in real time, in real policy decisions with real consequences. And yesterday's announcement, paired with that federal judge's ruling, makes one thing painfully clear. This isn't just about climate change. It's about credibility. It's about transparency. And it's about whether the people making the biggest decisions of our time are willing to deal with facts or just with the facts that they like. We have to watch closely because unlike certain policy announcements, the climate doesn't issue press releases. All right, before I get out of here, let's do this week's high note. Over the past few years, especially over the past year, it has felt like the country has been stuck in a permanent state of tension. Every news cycle feels like a new argument. Every political speech feels like it's aimed at dividing us into smaller and smaller tribes. And sometimes if you let yourself sit in that long enough, you can start to feel like the division is winning. But every once in a while, something happens that reminds you that people are still people. Compassion still exists and courage still exists, and sometimes the best response to division is simply refusing to let it take root. This week, that reminder came in the form of a flag. At the Stonewall National Monument in New York, a place that holds enormous meaning in American history, the pride flag was removed following new federal directives tied to the current administration's policies. Now, if you know your history at all, you know that Stonewall is not just any place. It's widely considered the birthplace of the modern LGBTQ rights movement in the U.S. It's where, in 1969, a group of marginalized, often invisible people finally said, enough harassment, enough hiding, enough being treated like second-class citizens in their own country. Stonewall represents resistance. It represents dignity. It represents the simple but powerful idea that everyone deserves to live openly and safely as themselves. So when the pride flag, a symbol of that dignity, was taken down, people noticed. And they didn't just notice quietly. Local activists, community members, and elected officials showed up. They brought their own pride flags. They raised them again. And they made it clear, if the flag comes down, we'll put it back up. If it comes down again, we'll raise it again. As many times as it takes. No screaming, no violence, no chaos. Just people standing together and saying, in the calmest, most American way possible, you don't get to erase us. There's something deeply moving about that. Something steady and grounded, because this wasn't about winning a political argument. It wasn't about scoring points on cable news. It was about visibility. It was about respect. It was about the simple idea that the story of America includes everyone, not just the people currently holding power. And if we're being honest, that quiet determination feels especially powerful right now. Over the last several years, the Trump administration and much of the modern GOP have leaned heavily into rhetoric and policy decisions that many LGBTQ Americans experience as openly hostile. We've seen efforts to roll back certain non-discrimination protections. We've seen fights over whether LGBTQ history or identity can even be acknowledged in schools. We've seen heated debates over healthcare access, military service, adoption rights, basic legal recognition. Now, supporters of these policies will often frame them differently. They'll talk about religious liberty, they talk about parental rights, they talk about tradition, and those are conversations a democracy can have. But from the perspective of many LGBTQ Americans and their families and friends, the end result often feels the same, like their lives are being debated as if they are theoretical rather than real. And here's the thing that makes this complicated. For a lot of conservative Americans, this isn't about personal hatred. It really isn't. In my own experience, and I suspect in many of yours, I tend to see two broad categories when it comes to attitudes towards LGBTQ people. Maybe not the only two categories, but two distinct categories. The first group is made up of folks who don't really know anyone in the LGBTQ community. Maybe they grew up in environments where being openly gay or trans just wasn't visible. Maybe they live in areas where it's still relatively rare for people to be out. And when you don't know someone personally, it becomes very easy to rely on stereotypes. It becomes very easy to treat a group of human beings like an abstract idea instead of neighbors, coworkers, family members. When people are abstract, empathy is optional. And when empathy is optional, prejudice can slip in with almost no resistance. But there's a second group that I find even more complicated. These are people who absolutely do know LGBTQ individuals. They have a gay cousin, they have a lesbian coworker, they have a transgender neighbor, maybe even a child or a sibling who is part of that community. And in their day-to-day lives, they treat those individuals with kindness, with respect, sometimes with genuine affection. They'll tell you sincerely, I don't have a problem with gay people. I treat everyone the same. And on a personal level, they often mean it. But then, and this is where the disconnect happens, those same individuals will support politicians or policies that actively work against the rights, protections, or even recognition of those very same people they claim to care about. It's a strange contradiction. To be kind to the person in front of you while supporting systems that make that person's life harder, to say, I love my gay friend, while voting for leaders who argue that friend shouldn't be able to marry or adopt or serve openly or simply exist without legal obstacles. It's not always born of cruelty. Sometimes it's just habit. Sometimes it's party loyalty. Sometimes it's the belief that other issues, taxes, immigration, the economy, simply matter more. But from the perspective of LGBTQ Americans, it can feel like being told, I care about you, just not enough. And that's why moments like the one in Stonewall matter so much. Because what happened there wasn't about shaming anyone. It wasn't about forcing anyone to change their beliefs overnight. It was simply about visibility, about presence, about reminding the country that LGBTQ people are not simply a talking point or a campaign prop. They are human beings with families and jobs and dreams and the same desire for dignity that we all have. When that pride flag went back up, it wasn't just a piece of fabric on a pole. It was a signal to LGBTQ kids watching the news and wondering if their country still sees them. A signal to older generations who spent decades fighting just to live openly. A signal that even when political winds shift, community doesn't disappear. And here's the part that makes this a true feel-good story. The response wasn't driven by anger. It was driven by care. People showed up peacefully. They stood together. They raised a symbol. They refused to let negativity define the moment. That's not division. That's democracy in its most human form. It's easy to believe that the loudest voices represent the majority. Social media will definitely make you think that. Cable news will make you think that even more. But on the ground in real life, most Americans still believe in basic fairness. Most Americans still believe in treating their neighbors with decency. Most Americans, even when they disagree politically, don't actually want to see anyone pushed back into the shadows. Sometimes people just need reminders. Sometimes they need to see courage modeled in a way that isn't confrontational or hostile. Just steady, just present, just human. That's what the folks at Stonewall offered this week. A reminder that visibility matters, that dignity matters, that you don't have to scream to stand firm. Sometimes you just show up, lift something back into the air, and let it wave. So as I wrap up, let me leave you with that image. A flag coming down and going back up. Coming down and going back up. As many times as it takes. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of simple belief that everyone deserves to be seen. In a country that feels divided in 1,000 different ways, maybe that's the most helpful thing of all. That there are still people in every corner of this nation willing to stand quietly for one another's dignity. Willing to say, through their actions more so than their words, that inclusion isn't really a partisan idea. Compassion is not a partisan idea. Basic human respect isn't a partisan idea. And that no matter who happens to be in power at any given moment, those values are still very much alive. All right, listeners, that brings this episode to a close. I want to thank you for taking the time to download and listen, and remind you that the website for the podcast is up and running, www.neighborontheleft.com. There will be blog post versions of the script for this and upcoming episodes. There are links to the social media platforms and the email address for contact. And there is also a web player where you can listen to or download any of the episodes of the podcast going back to the very beginning. We'll be back on Friday with another installment of Back Porch Files. So until then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you wish for others.